This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. What you are watching is quieter than that and more dangerous, because something foundational is being tested, not with speeches, not with votes, but with money, with permits, with delays that feel technical until they aren't. A system designed to distribute power by rules is being nudged carefully toward distribution by loyalty, slowly enough that it can be argued away, softly enough that it sounds procedural. And here's the problem. When rules stop being automatic, they become negotiable. And when they become negotiable, they become weapons. You don't feel it all at once. You feel it later, after the precedent has settled in. So stay with me. Because this is not about what happened, it's about what is now possible. And once that line moves, it never moves back. Which brings us to who actually controls the system now and why it's no longer who you think. What actually runs a system like this is not ideology. It's leverage, not speeches, not elections. Leverage. Who decides when money moves? Who decides when a permit survives? Who decides which delay is routine and which one never ends? On paper, this system is balanced. Branches checking branches, rules checking power. In practice, something else has taken the wheel. Control over friction. Because you don't have to change the law to change outcomes. You just have to decide where the law slows down, where it suddenly requires clarification, where it becomes conditional. This is how the system is being reprogrammed, quietly, through discretion dressed up as administration. When distribution depends on favor, compliance stops being voluntary. It becomes preventative. People adjust behavior not because they're convinced, but because they're afraid of being next. And here's the destabilizing part. This kind of control doesn't announce itself. It feels normal until it's everywhere, which raises the question that matters most. When did this start feeling ordinary? That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, and that's what makes it dangerous. There was a time when the system worked loudly. You could see decisions being made. You could trace cause and effect before funding followed formulas. Permits followed timelines. Grants followed criteria written down where everyone could read them. Now, the shift is subtle. Nothing is officially rewritten. Nothing is formally overturned. Instead, everything becomes conditional. Money is still authorized. It just pauses. Projects are still approved. They just wait. Rules still exist. They're just interpreted differently depending on where you stand. This is the most dangerous kind of change, not rupture. Normalization, because slow change trains people. It teaches states, institutions, organizations how to behave without being told, how to anticipate punishment, how to avoid attention, and once behavior adjusts, power doesn't need to be enforced. It's internalized. Here's the part most people miss. By the time anyone argues about fairness, the system has already moved on. Precedent has been set quietly, case by case. And when the first visible shocks arrive, they feel isolated. Like exceptions, like mistakes, they're signals. And the first one is already on the record. The first visible shock didn't arrive as a speech. It arrived as a subtraction. Money that had already been approved, already assigned, already promised, and then selectively it was pulled back. Not everywhere, not evenly. Only in certain places. Places that had followed the rules, filed the paperwork, met the criteria. The explanation sounded technical, budgetary, temporary. But inside court filings, something slipped. An admission that the funding would remain untouched in some states and stripped from others. Based not on policy, but on how those places had voted. That matters more than it sounds. Because this wasn't about energy. It was about whether Congress still decides where money goes, or whether that decision can be rewritten after the fact. A judge stopped it, called it illegal, ordered the funds restored, which sounds like resolution. It wasn't, because the attempt alone changed the map. It proved the idea had been tested. And once an idea is tested, It doesn't disappear. If this was possible once, where else could it be tried? If this was blocked here, what happens when it moves somewhere quieter? Keep watching, because the next move didn't involve money at all. It involved permission. Here's where the system reveals itself. Because when money can't be touched directly, power reroutes. It looks for softer infrastructure. Permission, timing, process. This is where regulation becomes leverage. You don't cancel a project. You suspend it. You don't revoke approval. You reopen review. Nothing dramatic. Nothing headline-worthy, except the cost. Every delay burns capital. Every pause scares investors. Every reopen question introduces risk. And risk does the work for you. The project in question had permits, years of review, compliance documented line by line, and then suddenly it didn't matter. A shutdown order arrived anyway, not because of new evidence, not because of safety, but because discretion still existed somewhere in the chain. The court stepped in again, called it unlawful, blocked it. But notice the pattern. The damage isn't just in what succeeds. It's in what has to survive repeated attack, because the beneficiaries are invisible. They're the ones who never have to file suit, the ones whose projects glide forward untouched. And the cost that's absorbed elsewhere by states, by workers, by markets that now price in political loyalty, which raises the pressure, because if permits can be weaponized, so can grants. And the next test moved there. This one moved faster. No long process. No slow review. Just a cut. Funding removed after criticism. Not after misuse. Not after failure. After speech. A professional body spoke out, questioned leadership, used language that made the administration uncomfortable, and then the grants disappeared. That's not a policy dispute. That's a signal. It tells every other institution watching exactly where the line is, critique costs money. Silence is safer. Except this time, the court didn't hesitate. It didn't parse intent delicately. It called it what it was: retaliation, illegal, unconstitutional, funding restored. But again, listen carefully. The ruling didn't undo the lesson. The lesson had already landed. If your survival depends on federal approval, you learn quickly which risks are worth taking and which ones aren't. This is how pressure scales. Not through force, through fear of friction, and now the scope widens. Because if grants can be pulled and permits can be stalled, then elections themselves become a target. And that's where the system finally hit a wall. Now it reaches you, not abstractly, not philosophically, practically, because when funding becomes conditional, the effects don't land on institutions first. They land on schedules, on services, on families who never see the memo explaining why something stalled. Childcare that suddenly costs more, health coverage notices that arrive without warning, programs that exist on paper but not in practice. You are told this is administrative, temporary, under review. But what you feel is instability. You plan around systems you're told are fixed, and then they aren't. And here's the quiet recalibration. You start factoring politics into survival decisions you never should have to politicize: where to live, what to rely on, what might disappear next. This is the human cost of leverage governance. Not dramatic collapse, chronic uncertainty. So if this feels familiar, that's not coincidence. That's design. And if you're still here, stay here. Because what happens next doesn't stay domestic. Systems like this don't stop at borders. They echo outward. And once they do, they come back changed. What begins as a domestic tactic doesn't stay domestic, because systems watch each other. When investors see permits reversed for political reasons, they don't just adjust one project. They adjust assumptions about stability, about predictability, about whether rules mean the same thing tomorrow as they did yesterday. That recalibration doesn't stop at state lines. Capital moves globally. Supply chains stretch across borders. Allies and competitors read the same signals. If regulatory outcomes depend on political alignment, then risk models change. Insurance costs rise. Long-term investment slows. And here's the part that rarely gets said out loud. When a country teaches that loyalty matters more than law, other governments learn the lesson too. Some imitate it, some exploit it, some prepare for volatility they didn't create. This is how internal friction becomes external weakness. Not through collapse, through erosion of trust, because credibility is cumulative. And once it starts leaking, it doesn't do so evenly. So now the question isn't whether the system can absorb one more shock. It's whether the rest of the world will wait to see if it does. And that brings us to what happens next. Not one future, 3, none of them comfortable. From here, the system doesn't snap in one direction. It fans out 3 paths, all already visible. The first is adjustment. Institutions harden. Courts intervene faster. Legislators defect earlier. The system learns to brace itself against pressure instead of assuming good faith. Nothing breaks. But everything becomes slower, more procedural, more defensive. The second path is erosion. Not dramatic, incremental. Each blocked action teaches a workaround. Each ruling narrows the next attempt. Pressure doesn't stop. It refines. Over time, rules still exist, but they matter less than access, less than alignment, less than whether friction finds you or passes you by. And then there's rupture. This is the one nobody plans for. It happens when enough actors stop believing the guardrails will hold, when compliance collapses into preemption, when courts are overwhelmed, when legislatures fracture beyond repair. Not chaos, something colder. Parallel systems, competing claims of authority. Everyone insisting they're still following the rules. None of these futures announces itself. They overlap. They borrow from each other. And the most dangerous moment is not when one wins. It's when you can't tell which one you're in. Because by the time that becomes clear, choice is already gone. There's one last thing you need to see before this ends. This doesn't end with a verdict or an election or a single correction that snaps everything back into place. Because systems don't fail that way anymore. They stretch, they adapt. They learn how close they can get to the line without crossing it. What you've been watching isn't chaos. It's calibration. Every blocked action teaches something. Every judicial intervention maps a boundary. Every legislative defection redraws the math. And that knowledge doesn't disappear. The danger isn't that the system breaks tomorrow. It's that it becomes permanently conditional. That power is no longer exercised by rule, but by testing how much resistance remains. That's not a crisis you feel all at once. It's one you adjust to. So don't look for the moment when it's over. Watch for the moment when it stops surprising you. Because that's when leverage governance wins. Not loudly, not violently, but quietly, through repetition. If you're still here, that matters. Stay engaged. Follow where this goes next. Because the next phase doesn't ask permission. It assumes precedent. And once assumption replaces law, the system doesn't need to announce the danger anymore. It just lives inside it. We'll keep tracking this because the most important signal is still ahead.